Thank you very much. We wanted to thank the Cambridge Forum for inviting us and all of you for showing up. I'm going to tell a quick story before Jackie tells you a little about the book. A few months ago, I got a message from a patient of mine, a very dynamic school principal, canceling her appointment with me at the end of the day. Her message was something like this: "It's been incredibly busy at work today. I'm just completely exhausted. I have a terrible headache. I think the best thing I can do is just go home and go to bed. I'm really okay, and I'll see you next week." I listened to the message and I wondered, should I call her? She'd been through a very messy divorce. She'd been depressed. She'd had some very hard times along the way, but she'd made it through with my help and the help of her old friends and her grown children. And her phone message made sense to me, so I didn't call. Later that night, she called. Could I see her the next day? She'd spent the evening on the internet trying to buy a gun. It turns out it's hard to do legally in Massachusetts. She'd planned to kill herself. When she left the first message, she really had felt okay, just exhausted, but at home, feeling very alone. In the nighttime, she became convinced that she'd worn out the goodwill of all of her friends and her children and of me, and she couldn't ask for anything more from people, and she couldn't make it alone. As you listen to Jackie, you might think to yourselves about times you yourself, hopefully less dramatic times, have asked yourself that same question I did. Should I call? With friends who say, my life is just too busy now, I'm exhausted, and you wonder, should I call? Should I bother them? Or more often, you might just notice that a friend has stepped back a little and always seems to be busy with something else. So again, you wonder, should I call? I'd ask that you think about that in your own experience as you listen to what Jackie has to say.
Thank you. Well, let me just tell you a little bit about how we came to write this book. 12 years ago, we wrote a book called Overcoming Loneliness in Everyday Life, which is really to bring loneliness out of the closet. We wanted to destigmatize loneliness because we felt that everybody was so embarrassed that it took people too long to admit that they were lonely and then try to solve the problem. And instead, they often came to us hoping for a psychiatric diagnosis. So that book was more of a self-help book with some ideas and some anecdotes about how to acknowledge the problem and work on solving it. And because of that book, in 2006, when there was a publication of new data showing that that trend towards social isolation was getting even worse, NPR decided to talk it over on a radio show, On Point. And they asked me to come be part of it along with the sociologists who had found the new data. And the sociologists were named Miller McPherson and Lynn Smith Lovins, and they had general social survey data that was from all across the country. And let me tell you about that survey. That survey looks at many quality of life issues, and they go all across the country interviewing people from all ages and all walks of life and all ethnic groups, and ask them about the quality of their life. And the particular questions aimed at social isolation were, let me just read to you an example. From time to time, people discuss important matters with other people. Can you tell me in the last 6 months who you've discussed important matters with? And back in 1985, when they asked that question, 10% of the people said no one. And that was really stunning, that 1/10 of the people said no one. But then when they went back in 2004 and asked the exact same question in the same way to all these people in face-to-face interviews, 25% said no one. So that was kind of stunning information. And in addition, the average number of confidants back in 1985 had been about three people with whom you could discuss important matters. But by 2004, it was only 2. So it seemed that this epidemic of social isolation was getting worse. Now, on the show, I talked a little bit about some of the ripple effects that I thought was coming from this trend. And we discussed increased social abuse, increased medical problems because the immune system is depressed, increased psychiatric problems, and even increased global warming, because when people are isolated, they tend to use more resources. And the next day, actually somebody in this audience, Christine Cipriani, an editor from the United Universalist Press, Beacon Press, called up and asked whether Richard and I would want to write another book about the same topic. But this time not a self-help book, but more a book talking about why was this happening? What was there about our little moment in culture, our moment in history, that made us want to isolate ourselves when we lived in such a seemingly friendly and prosperous country? It used to be prosperous, remember? So Richard and I brainstormed and put our clinical experience of 30 years apiece together and looked carefully at the research in this area and our own life experiences and came up with the following, for want of a better term, push-pull theory. We are pushed into retreating from a kind of overstimulating, frantic world where the productivity and the need for quick responsiveness makes us all tense and anxious and a little bit frantic. We never feel like we're doing enough. So this causes us to retreat, to wish to retreat, and there are lots of things, lots of little baby steps we can do to retreat. And in fact, everyone else seems to be doing them, so what's the big deal? We can work from home, we can shop from home, we can watch our movies from home, we can stop answering the telephone because it's just too much trouble and it's usually a solicitor. And we can be like those really cool young people who seem to work on their laptops from home and they don't even have to put on their work clothes. They just sit there looking like they're having a lovely time at home all day. Those are the ones in the commercials. We're also, the pull part of the theory, is that we're pulled by a kind of iconic hero in American culture. The notion that you can be idealized outsider hero or heroine. And if you don't need other people and you're not too well connected. And we know that this is very idealized because every time someone runs for president, they're always persuading us that they are really the true outsider. No matter how much like an insider they look, they're always convincing us that they're the real outsider. So we know that if we step back from being part of the mainstream, in America it won't be quite as lonely because we'll have all those idealized heroes to keep us company. Sooner or later, after we retreat, we start to feel a bit lonely and left out. Just imitating everyone else can get us into trouble nowadays. But what we usually don't realize is that we gave off signals to others that we were just a bit too busy to socialize. There's a kind of cult of busyness. One of our good friends said the other day, it used to be, 15 years ago when you had a neighbor you liked, you'd do all you could to go and visit them. Now if you have a neighbor you like, you try your best not to bother them. So the situation of feeling left out can become a chronic condition. And when people feel left out, they try to compensate for their left out feelings by eating too much, by drinking too much, lazing around in front of the TV, and trying to make things just the way they want them. And pretty soon they get a little set in their ways, and they may have lost the ability to compromise that you have to have when you're part of a family or a relationship or a community. And it's also true that that business of wanting everything just your own way can use up a lot of resources. Now, just to talk about that for a second, even before this general social survey data came out, there was the census data, which ever since 1940 has been changing in the direction of more and more one-person households. So that whereas in 1940 there were about 7% one-person households, by 2000, the 2000 census, there were 25% one-person households over the whole country, which seems like a huge amount, but it's nothing compared to Cambridge or Manhattan or San Francisco, where it's in the 40%. So to go on, you might think that in nuclear families this is just not a problem because at least in a nuclear family you have each other to keep you company. But it turns out that in nuclear families we are cocooning more than ever. And Robert Putnam in his book Bowling Alone has shown that we socialize much less than we used to. Families socialize less, 1/3 less often between 1974 and 1998. And single people socialize something like 40% less than they did during that same time period. So it turns out that nuclear families are focused inward and single people are feeling left out. And because that level of activity in families is so frantic nowadays, with 2 working parents often and children with much too much homework and activities, people, even at home, are all kind of flopping in front of the TV in their own rooms just to get what they think will be a little peace and quiet from each other. So just to review, we talk about the ripple effects that Fred mentioned, and I'm just going to very briefly go over them, and then Richard will tell us about them in more detail. The ripple effects of social isolation are incredibly widespread. People are much more prone to getting sick and even dying when their immune system is depressed, as it gets when you're socially isolated. The civic and political health of our nation suffers when people are not well connected with their communities. Global warming and indiscriminate use of resources is more likely when people try to live independently rather than in some mutually dependent situation. We become more paranoid and fearful when we don't have other people to confide in and compare notes with. And if you just think about how rarely nowadays you see children playing in groups out in the neighborhood, you realize how much paranoia is around. And people are much more prone to drug abuse and even taking prescribed drugs and drinking, because if you feel like you can't count on other people, at least you can count on taking your medicine or taking your drink at a regular time, and you can count on it. You can control it. So there's much more of all those things since we've become such an isolated nation. Before I hand the mic back over to Richard, I just want to say that I think the fact that there's so many mental health professionals like ourselves is actually a problem, because it makes people assume that if they're lonely, it must be their own personality flaw. But actually, people from other countries immediately are able to diagnose us as a kind of workaholic, lonely nation, unless they happen to come from one of those other workaholic, lonely nations. We're so prone to thinking that we can improve ourselves that we don't notice how much the societal problem of loneliness and feeling chronically left out has emerged. And since the stigma of loneliness is still much worse than the stigma of mental illness, most people would rather search for a diagnosis than admit to themselves or others that they're lonely. Thank you.
At the center of all of this is the idea that feeling left out is important, that it's one of the major engines of human affairs. I'm just going to mention a few intriguing science facts to back up that idea, and then say a few words about technology, because that's usually the first question we get. Here's a quote from a recent international conference on attachment and bonding. Positive social relationships are second only to genetics in predicting health and longevity in humans. That connection, which is pretty well known, between social relationships and health, really hit the front pages with a 1988 article published in the journal Science that looked at several large-scale epidemiologic studies in different parts of the country. And the one-sentence conclusion that they came to is approximately this: isolated individuals are twice as likely to die in a 10-year period as their more socially connected neighbors. And that effect seems to be the direct effect of being isolated or lonely. It's not mediated by all those behavior changes that you think might go along with being lonely that Jackie already mentioned. This is after you factor out things like alcohol use, smoking, not exercising, not seeing your doctor, all those sorts of things that might go along with being more isolated. This is just from the social distance itself. Over the next 20 years, people have spent a lot of time trying to tease out where loneliness and social isolation affects us biologically. And one really fascinating piece of the puzzle emerged in a study that was published about a year ago. They looked at the genetic expression, the activity of genes in human white cells. And it turns out that loneliness affects us at the level of our DNA, which is pretty basic. They looked at people in two categories. The expression that they used was perceived social isolation. People who felt it and people who didn't feel it. By perceived social isolation, they mean just simply that you don't count social contacts. You ask people, are you lonely and left out or not? And what they found is that feeling lonely and left out changes the level of activity of more than 200 genes in our white cells, most of which are related to the building blocks of our immune system. So why, you might wonder, does social connection affect us so strongly in a biological way? My best answer is a quote from a Stanford sociologist, Patricia Barkus. Over the course of evolution, the small group became the basic survival strategy developed by the human species for dealing with almost any circumstance. The basic survival strategy of the human species. So if our survival as a species depends on forming and maintaining small groups, we better have a biology that supports those small groups, and we better have a biology that's very sensitive to any indications of threats to our connection to the group. And it turns out we have that kind of biology. My point is that the pain we experience when we feel lonely or left out is not the result of having heard too many romantic love stories. It's not the result of too much attention being paid to Valentine's Day at this time of year. It's not the result of being overly sensitive or wimps. It's a pain that reverberates through something essential about our biological nature. Which brings me to some remarkable experimental results that without this lengthy preamble would seem just plain silly and unconvincing. Two social psychologists, Roy Baumeister and Jean Twenge, have studied social isolation, being left out in the laboratory. They've designed experiments to leave people out and then see what happens. Here are the two setups that they used. In one, college students meet in small groups for 15 minutes. This is a group of strangers. They're told that people are going to form working groups that like and respect one another, and are asked to name two people they'd most like to work with. Then the students are randomly assigned to one of two categories. The accepted category, I have good news for you. Everyone chose you as someone they'd like to work with. And yes, the rejected category, I hate to tell you this, but no one chose you as someone they wanted to work with. The second setup is a little more complicated. They give everybody a personality test. Give accurate feedback to become convincing that they know what they're talking about, and then, seemingly as a casual aside, say one of three things. You have the type of personality that over time tends to become more and more connected and have wonderful relationships and lots of friends and stable families, and late in life you're going to be really embraced by the bosom of loving people in your life, or words to that effect. The next group is told, you're the type who will end up alone later in life. You may have friends now, but you'll probably drift away from them. You may get married, but that probably won't last. You're going to be alone. And the last group was told, essentially, you're going to have a miserable life, but the reason is, even if you haven't noticed it yet, you're likely to become accident-prone and have lots of injuries and disabilities. But nothing about their social state. So let's be clear about these two situations. One setup makes people feel rejected by a few strangers who make no difference in their life, and the other makes people feel bad based on a prediction of a personality test about what their life is going to be like in 30 years, which you would hope nobody would take that seriously. So these are really minor interventions in people's lives, and they had astonishingly pervasive and important effects. The left-out people were more aggressive. They were more likely to torpedo a job application of someone. They were more likely to blast an opponent in a video game with what they thought was damaging noise. And they were more likely to do these things not just to the people who they felt left them out, but to neutral people, the equivalent of innocent bystanders. Social exclusion increases self-defeating behavior. These left-out people were more likely to procrastinate, to laze around instead of exercise, to take foolish, risky, long shots in games of chance, to read Entertainment Weekly instead of preparing for a test they were about to take, to eat more cookies, to choose the candy bar over the granola bar. Social exclusion also reduces intelligent thought. Their performance on complex cognitive tasks decreased after being left out. Their IQ scores dropped. And one other thing, if you were left out, if you were trying to do a frustrating, difficult task, you quit sooner. You might wonder, so were these people just depressed? But they weren't depressed. They actually didn't think they were miserable at all. They looked very carefully for signs of depression, and there were none. This was just the way people behave when they've been left out. And not, by the way, when they've been told you're going to have a horrible future, but because of bad accidents, not because of social exclusion. This is not relevant to what we're saying tonight, but you may worry about those students and what became of them. They actually were debriefed before they left the lab and didn't have to spend sleepless nights worrying about no one loving them. So social isolation affects our health, our productivity, even the safety of innocent bystanders. As Jackie mentioned, it affects our ecological footprint. But what about technology? Maybe we don't visit our neighbors so often. Maybe we live alone a lot of the time, but we now have all these wonderful technologies of connection. How well do they work? The real answer is we don't know yet. There are two major research groups that have looked at the social consequences of being on the internet, and they come to exactly opposite conclusions. One claims they have proof that it is the greatest thing since sliced bread for social connection. The other that it actually decreases your involvement with family and friends. We'll know more about this over time. But here's my last intriguing science fact. The orbital frontal cortex, somewhere here, is the part of the brain that seems to be where the ability to make social judgments is located. Without it, we misread social situations, act inappropriately, don't notice when we've made social mistakes so we don't repair them. So what information does our brain ordinarily need to stay on track socially? It turns out that the orbitofrontal cortex receives input from all 5 of the senses and even the state of our internal organs. Our brains use all the sensory information available to us, all the physical data it can get to monitor and modulate our social behavior. Social engagement is inherently a physical enterprise, or it has been, and we're starting to change that now. We don't really know the consequences of that kind of change, but at least some people think we've caught a glimpse of it in the way in which people can respond with hair-trigger anger to emails without the rest of that kind of data coming in. One thing is clear. Whether we look at social networks on the internet or old-fashioned neighborhoods, it's become easier and more acceptable to sync from view, at least for a while. And once you sync from view, re-entry is hard for all the reasons we've been talking about. The franticness of daily life, our romanticization of the self-reliant loner, the behavioral changes that go along with feeling left out itself. The problem isn't simply the pathology of a lonely person. It's a collective problem, and it's not best addressed by giving all lonely people a diagnosis of either depression or social anxiety and an antidepressant medication, which increasingly is the assumption that people seem to make when they walk into our office feeling embarrassed by their loneliness. Stop here.
You're joining us at Cambridge Forum as we continue our discussion of the lonely American with Jackie Olds and Richard Schwartz, Associate Clinical Professors of Psychiatry at the Harvard Medical School. Jackie and Richard, I'm immensely grateful for your insightful and, I think, compelling analysis of social isolation. Now, as an introvert with monastic and mystical tendencies, I have often been alone without being lonely. How do you distinguish healthy solitude from loneliness?
I suppose two answers. One is that I do think it's a matter of balance. Even in monasteries, there is community. I have a patient who is an elderly former nun who simply misses the sense of community that she had when she was a nun and has found nothing quite comparable to that in life. So I think partly it's a question of balancing them, and what we're suggesting is that we're out of balance. Not that we're against solitude. Lord knows I don't want to spend all my time with people either. You need some time away, but I think people seek it out and get stuck there these days in ways that are hard to get out of.
Well, I think most people can tell when they've passed over from comfortable solitude to being lonely. And it's hard to exactly put your finger on, but I think all of us, one of the things we wanted to emphasize in both books is that everybody's been lonely at times, and everybody knows what delightful solitude can be like.
As a Unitarian Universalist minister, I was delighted to find religion among the remedies to social isolation you offer in your book. And I hope many in our audience will come back Sunday morning and see for themselves. But I was dismayed by the aphorism you quote approvingly. If you don't believe that your religion is the one true religion, then you don't have a religion. This definition knocks out not only us Unitarian Universalists, but also most Buddhists, Hindus, and liberals of all faiths, including Christianity. Do you think that an exclusive claim to truth is essential to religion, and in particular to its power as a remedy to alienation and loss of meaning?
Let me place that aphorism in context. We were quoting a psychiatrist named George Valiant, who was in turn quoting one of his professors when he was in college, probably 50 or 60 years ago. I think there are. I think the point we were just trying to make is that religions are both sources of connection and community, and at times have been very divisive forces in history that have kept people from connecting with each other, and that both are true of them. Although probably not of the Unitarian Church.
You're listening to Jackie Olds and Richard Schwartz discussing The Lonely American. Let's take some questions from the audience. Please line up at the microphone.
Thanks. My concern is with the prescription, not with the diagnosis. You've given the diagnosis, as you know. There have been a long string of books dealing with loneliness in American society, going back at least to, as you mentioned, Pursuit of Loneliness, Lonely Crowd, probably before. And yet, if anything, according to your own data, things have gotten worse, or at least not better. So why do we believe, or should we be believing that because of diagnoses like the one you're making in your book, that things will get better? How do we change things around? Might someone in your position, for example, be recommending structural changes in American society, or putting this issue of isolation on the national policy agenda, which of course it's not? How do you go about changing things so that folks like you, a generation from now, are not sitting in your chairs with another book talking about the same thing?
That is a great question. And needless to say, as we wrote this book, we are worried about how you would change the pendulum swing. Now, there are some indications that the pendulum might be swinging, and what is that strange noise? Is that just something outside? Anyway, it would seem that already we noticed in the New York Times that some of the condos that get advertised in the Times, and this is not for every man exactly, but these are for rich New Yorkers, that they're starting to have common spaces where they can have group breakfasts, and that there are more co-housing kinds of things going on as single people want a little more community in their lives. But what I always get appalled by when I drive, even on the Southeast Expressway, is that our carpool lane, the HOV lane, never has any cars in it because everybody's in their own car. They can't even get two people in the car. And it seems to me that the one maybe silver lining in being in a recession might be that people will start to depend on each other and to want to share, which could actually make a difference if people started thinking that way.
Uh, I, I think that it would be good to have it on the national agenda. It seems to me that that books like Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone have tried to put it on the national agenda by saying that it's not just an issue for individuals, but it's an issue for the successfulness of a democratic country. I don't know how much response there is to it. Certainly, there does seem to be. Well, actually, there are several other books, competing books about loneliness that are emerging around the same time. So maybe there's a greater awareness that can do what you hope with it.
Hi, you mentioned changes on a genetic or gene level with people who are lonely. I'm wondering if anyone's studied people with Asperger's who don't seem to have that need or the ability to make that connection. Are there different genetic changes with them than there would be with the normal population?
I want to be clear that these are changes not in, they're changes in the expression of genes, not in people's genetic makeup that have been studied.
Okay.
Jackie's a child psychiatrist, probably can speak more about Asperger's than I can.
You know, very often the children I've dealt with Asperger's are held very closely by their families, and in fact are the opposite of isolated because they often need to be closely held by a family that understands them and treasures them. Mm-hmm. But it is true probably that people in adult life who have some Asperger's have a little more trouble putting themselves in others' shoes and end up feeling a little bit isolated because they have some trouble with empathy. And so I don't know about the genes, and I don't know whether the genes have been studied properly, but I bet they have.
Because my understanding is they just don't feel the need for connection in the same way that most of us do. Okay.
Well, I think in a different era, it wouldn't have been called Asperger's, it would have been called self-contained. And there's a wonderful book by Anthony Storr about solitude and about all the incredibly important contributors to our civilization who were solitary in their style of life.
We live in a neighborhood that's 70% gentrified. People have lived there 5 years or less. And we see a lot of people that are very uncomfortable in their skin walking in the neighborhood. They don't attempt to relate to each other or talk to each other. They just go about their daily activities, really isolated. It's very obvious. How do you create a sense of community? How do you reach out to these people and get them interested in participating?
I grew up in solitary Manhattan without the real experience of a neighborhood. I had the experience when we moved into our neighborhood in Cambridge of suddenly discovering what it was like to actually have neighbors who we knew. As it happened, many of them were older families, partly with roots in the Midwest, and they taught us how to be neighbors. They brought us casseroles when our children were born. They invited us over and made sure that everybody on the street was also invited. They taught me at least, Jackie may have known more about it, what being a neighbor was like if you took neighborhood seriously. I think that's still possible to do. I don't know what you think.
I think what I found is that you have to be very willing to make overtures, which are essentially fishing expeditions to see who recognizes an overture when they see it and sort of takes the olive branch and reciprocates. And it can be over simple things. I mean, even the crime watch in a neighborhood allows people to watch each other's, garages and make sure bicycles aren't stolen. Then if you start watering each other's plants and taking care of each other's pets and, watching to make sure that mail isn't left on the front porch, all of that is the beginning of a neighborhood network. And it means that someone in that neighborhood has to be willing to go out on a limb and make lots of overtures. And pretty soon you can have block parties and neighborhood potlucks where people finally start to get to know each other.
All right, thank you.
So that's a good segue to my question. This notion of fishing expeditions, I'm perceiving that there's sort of two classes growing in society. Those who at some point in their life have known what this sense of connectedness is, and perhaps a younger generation that may have not experienced it. And if I could indulge in just a brief metaphor, Garrison Keillor has a wonderful story about comparing giant red succulent tomatoes that you grow in your backyard versus what you buy in the supermarket. And he describes what you get in the supermarket as green styrofoam balls that are strip mined somewhere in Texas. And if you've only eaten the green styrofoam ball your entire life, you don't know that you're missing anything. So how do you fish those people?
Well, that is such a great question.
And a great metaphor.
Right. Well, the truth is that everybody has a yearning for belonging that Richard talked about being kind of built into our system, where we want to be part of small groups. And so that it's very rare, even for a young person, to have never had anything like a small group or any experience even with one parent that gave them a group of two, that made them understand how nice it is to come home or have a sense of belonging. But it is true that some people have much less experience with that than others. And essentially, in a way, it's up to all of us who have a sense of community to publicize that widely and talk about all the benefits. And here, most of those same young people who might have no sense of community, they're really good about going to the gym. So if they've managed to learn how important it is to go to the gym and exercise, maybe they could learn the same kind of thing about connecting. Thank you.
Hi, I noticed your book is not called The Lonely Canadian or The Lonely Mexican, and so, or The Lonely Italian or something. And so, and I also know that your book talks about the concept of tiebreakers. But my question is, do you have some feeling for uniquely American aspects of this problem in comparison to other countries, and not just the two that I mentioned, but as a comparative kind of thing?
We think what's particular to America is not the push of the frantic life, but the pull of the whole pantheon of self-reliant loner outsider heroes. Whether it's Emerson's essay on self-reliance, whether it's the picture of Thoreau in his cabin, whether it's Daniel Boone moving on when he saw the smoke from people's chimneys, whether it's Sarah Palin saying that I come from the frontier where I can do things that other people can't do and don't have the petty needs that other people have, that we idealize what it is like to be a person apart. Another version of that is the entrepreneur who works in isolation to create a new idea and then transform society. It's our business version of the cowboy who lives on the outskirts of town, who's the only one who can come in and save the town. What we think is uniquely American is that that's very appealing as part of our cultural mythology. And it soothes us when we start to feel alone in a way that I think is not true in all cultures.
Thank you.
Hi. Listening to you guys talk about the sort of the physical and mental problems caused by this degree of social alienation, I have to say that they sound a lot like the mental and physical problems between people who consider themselves optimists in life and people who consider themselves pessimists. It's actually kind of striking listening to you guys describe it. So is there a connection between your outlook on life and your degree of social alienation, and why do the symptoms of not having good one or the other seem so similar?
That's a great question. There's two brothers, one of whom is named Daniel Freeman, who just wrote a book in England called Paranoia. And they came up with an incredible statistic, which happens to be just that same number that I was talking about. 25% of people in the UK qualify as paranoid on personality tests. And they are suggesting that it's because of the change in the amount of isolation, that the more socially isolated you are, the more you don't have anybody to check out your impressions with and to sort of confirm your perceptions, and pretty soon you can get carried away with your fears and your obsessions. So I think your point, which is I think that pessimists sound like the socially isolated people, that probably as you get more lonely and isolated, you get more pessimistic and fearful. And I think that's an incredibly good point.
I've not read your book, though it might address this issue. When people come to you and say, I'm isolated and lonely, what do you say? What do you say?
Well, we probably do start out acting like most psychiatrists and try to find out, why? And the only thing that we would do somewhat differently is we would look more widely at the social environment that someone is in about the why, and not just see it automatically as someone's depression or shyness or anxiety. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question.
What techniques there are for getting out of this?
Yeah, okay.
For getting out of it.
Well, that very first book we wrote, the Overcoming Loneliness in Everyday Life book, essentially what we said is that since people are so crazily busy, and in fact, Ned Hallowell wrote a book called Crazy Busy, which spoke to the same issue, that you, in a way, and this sounds so cold, but I don't mean it to sound cold, you have to engineer regular interactions with people into your life. So that if you could have, I see someone in my book group right there in the middle, if you have regular times where you see people, and that's why church or synagogue can be so terrific. If you have regular times that you have a babysitting cooperative, or you have a quilting bee, or you have a watercoloring group, or you have a time where you play tennis, and you see people regularly, even if they start off being strangers, over time you will get to know them better and you will feel them as friends eventually. But it really depends on regular contact, and it depends on having those regular ways of contacting people in your life. Okay.
In your book, you mentioned that men and women have different patterns of making friends, that women keep making friends throughout their lives, and men tend to make most of their friends early in life, and then as their friends drop out of the picture, they become more lonely. And I was wondering why this was so, and also whether this is changing with more women in the workforce, and also, if it is true, why do women end up being just as lonely as men?
Great question. You want to take it? All right. We're very self-conscious about that. No, I think that in different eras in history, sometimes men have been the keepers of the social network, and sometimes women have been. And we're at a moment in history right now where women are more likely to keep the social calendar than men are. And in fact, if you talk about people who have lost a spouse through death, women, in fact, are usually more connected and do better in terms of isolation or in terms of connection than men do. Now, my own theory about why there is that difference is because when, in a country like America where men and where everybody who works is supposed to work so full time, if you're trying your hardest to work full time and to be a good husband and father, there doesn't leave a lot of time for reconnecting with your old friends. And so back, you made friends when you had time to connect when you were a child, but you don't necessarily have time to make new friends as a grown-up. And when women were working part-time or not even working, they had some time to connect. But I think as women and men are working more and more together, equally hard schedules, that the sexes will start being equally isolated, which is a terrible thing. And I think part of the problem of being such a workaholic nation.
About 20 years ago, we did a small study looking at the effect of different patterns of childcare on marital satisfaction. And one of the things that we weren't really looking at but stumbled upon anyway is most of the people in that study, they were all couples with at least one child under 5. And all of the men worked, and almost to a man, what they each said was that they were really committed to their career and their job, in part because they liked it, in part because they had to be. They were really committed to being more available and present as a father than their own father had been to their own children. And that left no time for male friends. That something had to give, and what gave during the years of child rearing for everybody in this admittedly small sample was the time that they used to spend with their friends. I don't know if that's still true. I don't know how generalizable it is, but and I suspect that it's increasingly true of women as more and more women are working as hard.
Hi, I find your the message very, very compelling, and I really do believe it. But the thing I really wonder are we really lonelier now than people have been throughout history? I mean, I think of, you know, the whole sort of history of America and immigrants coming to this country and being far from family, and the fact that so many social networks and sort of traditional neighborhoods that we talk about were very exclusionary across race and class lines. You know, and I think about like The Invisible Man, Ralph Ellison's, I mean, you know, an incredible evocation of loneliness and isolation that's not something that's just kind of handled by going to church or, you know, meeting your neighbors. I think that, so I'm wondering a number of things about what is different about this moment, and the possibility that perhaps, although we don't know that much about social networking through technology, that perhaps there are some ways that may cross race and class lines that actually might get us somewhere that we haven't been before.
I think that's a very good question, and we couldn't help but wonder the same thing, which was, you know, is it so different now than it used to be? Now, when you talk about these exclusionary neighborhoods where, you know, maybe there was Little Italy and there was Little Ireland and, you know, it might be that those neighborhoods were exclusionary, but they were also closely knit. And there's a wonderful study of a little town called Roseto in Pennsylvania that was named after a town in Italy named Roseto. And a lot of those Italians emigrated to this town in America and, in fact, lived in that town very much as if it were a town in Italy. And when we read this study, it turns out everybody was in each other's business and all 3 generations would live in the same house. And it was a very closely knit kind of old world Italian society. And it turns out that people died of heart disease something like 15 years later than in the rest of America. And that
than in their neighboring communities.
And so it turned out that level of connectedness, even though it might drive some people crazy, was really good for their physical health. And when
I absolutely believe that. I mean, that's. I mean.
But I think you bring up you know, a question about groups that is a little like the question Fred brought up about religion, that in the time that you were talking about, there was probably both greater community within groups and less crossing of community across those lines. And it's hard to say whether, if you did studies of loneliness back then, what you'd find. Yeah.
Thank you.
I find myself thinking about the way in which some of what you're talking about, and I didn't hear all of it, may be understood in a way to be coded for race and class and even marital status, and I think that's probably, some of that is in the book. I think I used to live in the neighborhood in Cambridge where you live, in Cambridgeport. Is that where you live? Or no? North Cambridge. Okay. And lived there in the same place for a long time. I'm a pretty gregarious person. And there was shifts that happened over a couple of decades, and people with kids in the schools, couples, married people, couples, seemed to, middle class, higher income people began to move in more and more. And there was a shift in the feeling of the neighborhood, and I could see the kind of community that people who sort of fit that profile in a way, without simplifying it too much, the way they connected with each other. The ways that I would tend to look for connection would be in places like, there was this book years ago called The Great Good Place. There used to be places where people could connect. They could be bars, they could be the barber shop, they could be the coffee house. Sure. And this environment right here is one. So what I theorize, is that the constituency for defending those places has eroded in relation to the kind of shift I was alluding to in the neighborhood that I observed as sort of a more middle class, kind of family-oriented set of ways of finding community and establishing community were sufficient for people, even though they require effort in the ways that you described. The constituency for fighting to defend the eroding places where community could be found by people who maybe weren't married, but also by people who appreciate those, was diminished. And so we've lost those places. And so that's part of the difficulty of the loneliness. And even when you go into such a place like 1369 in Central Square, everybody's on a laptop. So I sort of, there's a kind of two-sided kind of thing that I'm positing for your comment.
That's terrific.
I'm inclined to just say that that was very eloquent and thoughtful, and I wouldn't want to try to improve on it.
Thank you. I think you're right.
I wanted to make a point about the role of the Cambridge Forum in creating this kind of a forum. It was started 41 years ago, precisely to provide community people and citizens an opportunity to interact with the experts. Because the notion here is that truth cannot be found just by, in the laboratory or in the whatever, nor can it be found just by citizens. It comes as a result of this interaction. And the genius of Cambridge Forum's founder, Herb Vedder, was to provide an opportunity for us people who live close enough to Cambridge to be able to do this. So I just wanted to make that point. And I'm interested in knowing what your view, thinking about that maybe since the 60s to this day, what's your view on the effectiveness of those efforts? And how did they, and what out of that could we learn for the future in terms of helping solve the problem?
Well, that is also a wonderful question. I think the fact that there don't seem to be quite those many efforts in today's community means that we've somehow moved in a slightly more selfish direction. And I hate to say that, but it doesn't seem to me that every street has a kind of agreement where they take care of the oldest person and make sure that person has enough groceries. Now, even back then in the 60s, I think there were little neighborhoods that worked that well, and then there were some neighborhoods that didn't. And it seems to me you have to have people trying to maintain the social fabric, and that those intentional communities were trying to make a social fabric and a safety net that would take care of people. And nowadays, somehow we've gotten into so much self-care that I think people sometimes feel they don't have enough time to take care of others because they have to spend so much time taking care of themselves. So I'm not so pleased with that direction. Thank you.
There was an article in Sunday's Boston Globe about the fact that the writer of the article, and he posited a lot of other Americans, are really never alone anymore. And I know you talked a bit about the difference between alone and lonely, but the kinds of behaviors he was describing, the distraction, the short attention span, the feeling that he had no time, that came from feeling constantly connected and constantly linked to a vast electronic community, sound a little bit like some of the behaviors you're describing for people who are alone and who can't, motivate themselves to stop watching television. And I'm wondering, is there some kind of a paradox here? Clearly, developing friendships and relationships requires time and repetition, and being connected electronically is a time eater. So I guess it's coming back to those two camps you talked about, Richard. What does technology do to foster our sense of community? And I wish you would say a little bit more about the technology question.
Let me just say one thing quickly, and then we'll give it to Richard. And that was just that I was thinking the other day about so many people sitting on the net hoping that a good email comes to them. And I was thinking that the lonelier you are and the more you start feeling left out, the more you're apt to spend your life on the internet. And that let's face it, most people don't just go to the internet, 3 times a day to check their emails. Most people spend hours surfing the internet. And it's a kind of vicious cycle, because the more you surf the internet and the more you give off signals to everybody else that you're very busy on your laptop, the more they don't include you, and you start feeling lonely and left out, and you have to go to that internet and you have to find somebody who's interested in you. And surely, even if it's a chat room with total strangers, you'll find someone.
I am inclined to go back to the wording of that question in the general social survey that Jackie spoke about, because I think, whether intentionally or not, it was a very smart question. With whom have you discussed matters of importance in the last 6 months? And then actually asking for names or initials. And they found this vast, empty space in a lot of people's lives. Other studies have simply, in a telephone survey, asked people, how many friends do you have? And usually the answer is very, very high. And I think that the question is the difference between lots of very brief contacts and actually spending enough time engaged with another person so you and that other person feel you know each other well. And I think those are different kinds of enterprises.
Well, hello and congratulations. We've never discussed this, but the whole discussion interests me because I'm an architect, as you know, and architects have to deal with solitude and loneliness in a lot of design, and how much design can play a role in mediating between those two polarities is a matter that has engaged us for generations. And there is a famous book written in the 70s by John Turner called Housing as a Verb, which took the emphasis away from the actual design of housing, but the process by which housing was made. And it was as much about building the building the fabric of the society as it was about building the fabric of the actual buildings. And there are some well-known housing complexes in Europe where the architects have actually chosen to live in the community for which they were building, invited members of the community to engage in the process of completely redeveloping a neighborhood after World War II bombing, etc. And those communities have tended to thrive because people have made connections over a common task, as opposed to the housing projects that are simply put up and they are sort of, as it were, dropped from the sky and do not work simply because the social process has not engaged individuals in that enterprise. So I don't know whether maybe you don't have to even answer that, but it's just an observation.
That is interesting.
I would add one observation to that. That town in Pennsylvania, Roseto, that Jackie talked about, that had the low rate of heart disease. One of the things that the researchers who investigated what was different about this town noticed is that that the houses were relatively close together, and all of them had front porches, and there usually was someone on the front porch. And Etzioni, the man who started the Communitarian Party, among other things, has proposed that there be a tax benefit for building front porches as just a kind of policy change to encourage the architecture of community. Yes.
I'm concerned about the coming economic downturn and how it's going to affect all these lonely people and everyone together, and what we can do as a community to ameliorate some of the problems. And have thought about the issue of some of the two places, I think Boston and Chicago, in dealing with a heat wave where they realized that many elderly people were alone and didn't have resources to keep cool. And this came out of many deaths. But the initiative was taken by the mayors to say to people in the community, check on your neighbor. And there was a fantastic result. They did create places to go that were cool. But I'm just wondering what you think Obama, the community organizer, and all of us in our communities can be doing when we're looking to the future and more of a crisis of loneliness and more need. What can the government's been doing?
My first thought is that the way in which the economic crisis is going to make loneliness and social isolation much worse is there's nothing lonelier and more socially isolating than being unemployed. Go ahead. Yeah.
But can we reverse that in that we're saying we're so busy before? Can we see that as a strength? There are more people around in the community. I'm a social worker.
Yeah.
I've lived and worked in low-income communities, and one of the strengths I see there, when there are other adults around, they are mobilized to help each other, and there are a lot of strengths in a poor community, people helping each other.
I think
Violence on the street hasn't helped that because they can't be out, people can't be out. But what can we do to reinforce those kinds of helping things as initiative?
Well, you've given an example that I'll place in a category, which is a public proposal of what people can do that could make a difference, that can bring people together in community in the midst of a crisis. One of the things we talk about in the book is an old study of boys at a summer camp and how they formed divisive groups over sports, and that the only thing that united these groups that had come to hate each other as 10-year-old boys was to engineer a crisis that could only be solved by everybody working together on it, like a water shortage at the camp. And they actually did these things in a 1940s study in a Boy Scout camp. And I think you're describing the same kind of intervention. We have a crisis that can only be dealt with by people coming together in some sort of concerted action, and that does make a difference.
Thank you.
In your book, you talk about the power of small daily choices to make a cumulative difference in our lives and in society. How has your research and writing of The Lonely American influenced the small daily choices each of you makes, especially in your marriage?
Well, one of the jokes that we often make about that very first book we wrote in 1996 was that after we wrote this book called Overcoming Loneliness in Everyday Life, which talked about the importance of reaching out and being more reciprocal and asking favors and then giving, essentially borrowing eggs from the neighbors and then reciprocating by giving them a cup of sugar, et cetera, was that it went completely against our grain because by nature we thought of ourselves as living in the little house on the big prairie, and we thought we were self-sufficient and we didn't need to ask any favors. But after we wrote the book, we had to live by it. So we actually changed completely. Now we borrow eggs all the time. And I try to borrow eggs from Richard sometimes.
And another version of that is that we write the book together rather than with other people. That one of the things we do know is that as much as shared tasks can sometimes lead to tension, and we wouldn't pretend that there aren't a fair number of fights involved in writing together, writing together, even with the fights, brings us closer together. And if we chose to do that with other people, it would bring us closer together with other people rather than each other. And it's made us aware of how much these things matter.
Thank you, Jackie Olds. Thank you, Richard Schwartz.